Our next speaker spent 20 years in the trenches for the drug war when she realized she was on the wrong side of the fight. And she's not the first person. Our vice presidential candidate, Judge Jim Gray, as we all know, has done tremendous amount of work. After, again, many years as a Superior Court judge and the son of a federal judge, for many years now, he's come out and he's been promoting the importance of drug legalization, in his case particularly marijuana legalization. But it doesn't, to me it doesn't matter, because the drug war is a war on all of us. It's a war on families, it's a war on children, it's a war in particular on minorities. I think the drug war has devastated the inner city black community like there's virtually no tomorrow. I mean, there are so many children out there now with dad incarcerated because he had a kilo of this or something, or whatever it may be. All right, fine, he had a nickel bag, whatever it might be. And you know, we've had some people in our party who have had some time where they spent as a guest of the United States government or the state of New York in one of their fine facilities, all as a result of a war on us, and a war which we should not be fighting. And there's this phenomenal organization that Peter Criss and several others formed called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, L.E.A.P. And it is my privilege to present to you another fighter from L.E.A.P, Joanne Naughton, please.
Joanne.
Joanne.
Don't worry about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here this afternoon, for asking me to speak to you about this country's drug policy. As you may know, I'm retired from the NYPD, where I was a police officer, a detective, a sergeant, and I retired as a lieutenant after over 20 years. I was also a criminal defense attorney representing indigent defendants in New York City. And I just retired fairly recently again from teaching criminal justice at Mercy College. I'm done working for a living, thank God. Yes, thanks. I want to speak today about this country's drug problem and how we're dealing with it. While I was a detective, I worked undercover in the narcotics division. I went out on the streets of the Bronx and Manhattan with a drug addict we had arrested who would introduce me to people he knew were selling drugs, dealers. And I bought marijuana, heroin, cocaine, pills, whatever was for sale. And my backup team...
What did you bring with you today for us?
I'm sorry? Whatever. And my backup team eventually arrested the people who sold me the drugs. Over the course of my years as an undercover narcotics detective, I made hundreds and hundreds of drug buys, and my teams arrested hundreds and hundreds of dealers, all in the name of the war on drugs. Here we are, decades later. I don't want to tell you how many decades later. Nothing's changed. People continue to use drugs. Police continue to lock them up. And let me assure you, most dealers are small-time drug users who sell to support their habits. By now, after more than 40 years of fighting the war on drugs, you would think this war would have been won, or that we would have faced the fact that it isn't working and tried something else. Yet in the 10-year period from 2002 to 2012, the NYPD spent 1 million work hours arresting 440,000 people for marijuana possession. I'm here today as a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, L.E.A.P, which is an international nonprofit organization founded in 2002 by 5 police officers. We now have nearly 200 speakers in 15 countries, police officers, prosecutors, judges, DEA members, U.S. Marshals, corrections officers, current and retired, who oppose our drug policy. And we have thousands of civilian supporters in more than 78 countries. L.E.A.P's mission is to educate people about what occurs out in the front lines of our failed drug policy. Our name, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, of course, refers to the prohibition of alcohol in this country back in 1920 to 1933. This period was characterized by violence and gangsters, and it was a period of time when even the average citizen routinely broke the law. Alcohol was blamed for many of society's ills, especially crime. But Prohibition failed to bring about the perfect, sober, crime-free world they hoped for. Then the country was hit by the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of what's called the Great Depression. I don't know what was so great about it, but people needed jobs and the government needed money. And that should sound familiar to us today. Making alcohol legal again opened up many new jobs, as well as providing new sources of additional, sorely needed revenue in the form of taxes. So for these reasons, and especially because many, many Americans violated the law, Prohibition came to an end when the 18th Amendment was repealed. Prohibition was characterized by violence, and today's war on drugs is no different. It is also characterized by violence, not from those who use drugs, but from the war on drugs. Drug dealers fighting in the streets of our city over the very lucrative illegal drug market. You don't see liquor store owners fighting turf wars in the street, shooting it out over the right to sell alcohol. Because the right to sell alcohol, beer, wine, booze, is regulated by state governments. We buy our alcohol these days from respectable business people. Many Americans believe it is a major waste of this country's resources for us to be putting so much time and money and lives into arresting and prosecuting nonviolent drug offenders. Drug users who are harming no one should either be left alone or given treatment if they want it. When we arrest them, we cause far more harm than drugs do. You can recover from addiction. You can't recover from a conviction. A felony conviction makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible in some cases, to have a profession, to get a job, housing, education. And the right to vote is lost forever for many people in this country with a felony conviction. The effect of incarceration on families and neighborhoods is devastating. This war on drugs hurts people more than drugs do. Drug addiction is a public health matter, not a matter for criminal justice. I don't see any role here for law enforcement. We know that most drug users aren't violent. Usually, they just want to be left alone. But the illegal drug trade is extraordinarily violent. Whether police officers are working undercover or clearing dealers from street corners or responding to shootouts in the street, they put themselves in harm's way because society, or at least our politicians, still seem to believe that law enforcement can win the war on drugs. Many of us, both active and retired members of law enforcement, have learned from our experience that this is a stupid and unwinnable war. Prohibition doesn't work. It never has. It never will. Every time we put a so-called drug kingpin away, there's a slew of others waiting to take his place. A job opening has been created. There's too much money involved in the illegal drug trade. The illicit drug market is far too lucrative to be arrested away. The prohibition of drugs began in this country in 1914 with the Harrison Act, and that was directed at doctors, which regulated opium, opium derivatives, and cocaine, largely because 1.3% of the population was said to be addicted to drugs at that time. 1.3%. Until then, anybody could go into a drugstore and purchase their drug of choice, including heroin, morphine, and cocaine. Then, years later, in 1970, President Nixon established the Schaefer Committee, named for its leader, Governor Raymond Schaefer of Pennsylvania. The committee was to study the effects of marijuana and make recommendations for an appropriate drug policy. Although President Nixon appointed 9 of the 13 members of the commission, when he found out that the commission was going to recommend decriminalization of marijuana, he warned Governor Schaefer not to do so. Nevertheless, in 1972, at the conclusion of its research, the Schaefer Commission announced the panel's results. They said, "We unanimously agree that marijuana use is not a desirable behavior, and that society should discourage its use. Nevertheless, we feel that placed in proper perspective with other social problems, citizens should not be criminalized or jailed merely for private possession or use." Well, President Nixon rejected the report, saying he would not follow any recommendation to legalize marijuana. And every president since Nixon, Democrat and Republican, has escalated the war, despite voter polls and local laws showing they should do otherwise. In 1972, justification for rejecting the commission's recommendations and for continuing the war on drugs included the fact that the addiction rate was about 1.3% of the population, just as it had been in 1914. Shouldn't that percentage have gone down, at least some, as a result of drugs having been illegal since 1914? Shouldn't there have been some indication that banning these substances had the effect of reducing use and therefore addiction? Let's talk about price and purity. When a commodity becomes scarce, the price goes up. When there's plenty of it around, the price goes down. We see that with our oil supply. When the gas and oil supply in this country goes down and there's less of it around to put in our cars and to heat our homes, the price goes up. And when there's plenty of fuel at all the gas pumps, prices go down. Not much, maybe, but they go down some. Now, if illegal drugs were to become scarce, hard to find, because we're doing a good job of keeping this stuff out of the country, prices should go up. And the quality should be poor, because there would be less of the drugs available. Through the 20-year period of the 80s and 90s, the opposite happened. Prices went down, purity went up. And today, drugs are purer, cheaper, and more available than ever. The DEA's heroin price and purity chart showed the price of what they call a dose. They showed the price of one dose of heroin from 1980 to 1999, 19 years, almost 20 years. The price fell from $3.80 a dose to 80 cents a dose. The purity went up from 3.6%, 3%, almost 4% in 1980 to 38% in 1999. When I was buying heroin on the streets of New York as an undercover officer in the early, I'm going to have to say it, 1970s, I can tell you that a bag of heroin was so diluted, it was called garbage. Shit. I'm going out to buy my shit, my garbage. And this is how it was referred to. By the year 2000, after over 30 years of fighting the war on drugs, a dose of heroin was over 60% pure in New York and even purer in some other cities. These are DEA figures. And I have to tell you, the DEA stopped providing this information after L.E.A.P started using it in 2002. If we put, why is purity so important? If we put contaminated gasoline in our cars, we can cause a great deal of damage to the cars. But we don't ever have to give it a second thought because the gas and oil business is regulated. We don't have to think twice about the gasoline we put in our cars or the oil we put in our furnaces. The industry is regulated. We know that when we fill up at the pump, what we're getting, any pump, anywhere, is exactly what it's supposed to be. Gasoline's not cut with water or something else. It's exactly what it's supposed to be. We can rely on the fact that any gas station anywhere in the country will have the same high-quality gasoline as every other gas station in the country because the industry is regulated. Purity matters. If I put contaminated gasoline in my car's ruined. When drugs are not regulated, users never know what they're putting in their bodies. Heroin may be cut with anything the dealer chooses. Powdered milk, baby laxative, rat poison. Anything that is a white powder. And these are substances that are used. Although the drugs that are for sale on our streets today are purer than ever, someone who purchases those drugs still can't be certain about what he's putting in his body. There are no assurances that the stuff this dealer sold him today is the same quality of stuff that this dealer sold him yesterday, or that that dealer sold him the day before. No assurances that what a person puts into his body won't be so pure that it will kill him. That's what an overdose is. Sometimes we hear about overdoses and we think, well, they're just shooting too much stuff in, maybe 2 bags instead of 1. No, it means that the stuff that they did ingest, one way or another, is purer than they expected, less filler. Heroin users are 4 times more likely to die of an overdose today than they were in 1979. The stuff is purer. We dehumanize people when we call them junkies, but every drug addict is someone's daughter or son, is loved by his or her children, is an important person in someone's life, and no one deserves to be at the mercy of street dealers. How prevalent is drug use? The number of people in the US over the age of 12 who had used illegal drugs in 2005 was 112 million, about 46% of the population. This is the number of people who have used illegal drugs, not the number of addicted people. And in fact, I hate to be the one to remind us of this shocking fact again, but 3 US presidents have tried marijuana, according to what I've read. I think it's true. The reality is, Americans want their drugs. Not all Americans, but a sizable number of Americans. And Americans will have their drugs, whether legal or illegal drugs. Make no mistake about that. Americans are the largest consumers of illegal drugs in the world. According to the CIA, Americans are the largest consumers of cocaine from Colombia, much of it brought up through Mexico, heroin from Colombia and Mexico, marijuana, ecstasy, and methamphetamine from Mexico, etc., etc., etc. Let's look at some of the costs of the drug war. Each year, the federal government spends about $20 billion on drug law enforcement. This doesn't include what each of the states spend. A few years ago, a noted economics professor at Harvard, Jeffrey Miron, estimated that federal and state governments spend roughly $41 billion a year enforcing the prohibition of drugs, fighting the war on drugs. $41 billion each year. Now get this, Professor Miron's report also estimates that drug legalization would yield tax revenues of $46.7 billion this year, next year, the following year, annually, every year. $46.7 billion. Now, that assumes legal drugs taxed at the rates comparable to those on alcohol and tobacco. Add in enforcement savings, you have a total yield of about $88 billion a year, each year. And what the federal government spends on prevention and treatment is what we might call chump change, $7 billion, just $7 billion. And I have to point out that although the current administration has shifted anti-drug rhetoric away from the war on drugs metaphor and started talking about drug abuse as a public health problem, one that needs a balanced policy response, the change in rhetoric has not been accompanied by any change in policy. States that have enacted medical marijuana laws have found themselves in trouble for violating federal drug laws. So despite the incredible increase in costs, federal spending has increased by more than 1,800% in the past 20 years. The war on drugs has failed. We know that the war on drugs will never work, no matter how much money we put at it, throw at it. Now, when I used to tell my students that the US has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, some of them thought it was a good thing. We're doing a good job of putting the bad guys away. In fact, it is something we should be ashamed of. This is an embarrassment. With a little less than 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Right now, we have about 7 million people in the system, over 2 million incarcerated, and the rest on probation or parole. And let me assure you, I'm not talking about 2 million murderers, rapists, robbers, or other violent criminals. About 25% of the people who are in because of a drug conviction. In addition to being a shameful commentary on how we're dealing with a public health problem, the money being spent keeping nonviolent people behind bars is money we could be using for other things. And to make things even more offensive, you couldn't find a more racist policy than the war on drugs unless you went back to the days of slavery in this country. Only about 13.5% of all illegal drug users in the US, not addicts, users, are African American, close to the percentage of African Americans in the population. And whites and blacks use illegal drugs at pretty much the same rate. In 2009, 9.6% of blacks and almost 9% of whites used illegal drugs, according to the US Department of Health and Human Services. But blacks are over 10 times more likely than whites to enter prison, over 10 times more likely to enter prison for drug offenses. And just to give this a little more context, in South Africa under apartheid, which some people won't remember, some of us do remember that policy, it was an internationally condemned policy as one of the most racist policies in history. In South Africa, at that time, they imprisoned 851 black men per 100,000. In this country, under the war on drugs, we incarcerate over 4,000 black men per 100,000. Violence is another cost of the war on drugs. Violence is a hallmark of the illegal drug trade. According to CNN, since 2006, as a result of former Mexican President Calderon's war on drug cartels, over 50,000 Mexican people have lost their lives. I mean, just imagine if I was saying Americans. 50,000 Mexican people have lost their lives. According to the L.A. Times, the struggle among Mexican drug cartels for control over the lucrative drug trade to the U.S. excuse me, has left thousands dead, paralyzed whole cities with fear, and corrupted the upper levels of the Mexican state. That's just Mexico. Colombia's had its problems with the war on drugs. Honduras and El Salvador now have horrendous murder rates. Since there will always be a demand for drugs, there will always be people willing to take the risk of supplying them. And higher risk leads to higher profits. The UN estimates that the global illicit drug market is worth $500 billion annually, year after year. According to some former undercover officers, drug dealers don't even count their money anymore. They weigh it. They weigh the bills. And let me mention at this point that this kind of money provides a tremendous temptation to police officers to do the wrong thing. A police officer with a family to support and a mortgage to pay off, who sees enough cash on top of the dresser in a drug dealer's apartment to pay off his entire mortgage, could be sorely tempted. One of the primary causes of police corruption is enforcing unenforceable laws. A number of years ago, there was a terrible scandal in New York City regarding the unit charged with enforcing gambling laws. It was discovered that the people who ran the gambling operations in the city were regularly paying off the police. Police officers were arrested, went to prison, some even committed suicide. After the scandal died down, it was decided that gambling was such a potent source of corruption, because Americans also want to gamble, that gambling laws would no longer be enforced in the city unless the police receive a complaint about gambling. They no longer proactively enforce these laws. That works. Our drug laws are just as potent and dangerous a source of corruption. Other countries have decided they're not willing to fight this unwinnable war on drugs. In the late 90s, drug abuse had become a significant and seemingly uncontrollable social problem in Portugal. The government appointed a commission to look at the problem and make recommendations. The commission determined that the best strategy for reducing Portugal's growing abuse and addiction problem was to decriminalize drugs. So about 10 years ago, Portugal passed a law decriminalizing all illicit drugs for personal use, including heroin and cocaine. The drugs are decriminalized, meaning they're not legal, but violations are considered administrative, like traffic tickets, rather than criminal. Instead of being sent to criminal courts and prisons, users are sent to counseling and, when necessary, treatment. No criminal record. Despite loud warnings to the contrary from the drug war hawks, drug abuse has already been cut in half. Drug-related crime has plummeted. There have been health benefits. Drug-related HIV cases dropped 75%. In 2002, 49% of people with AIDS were addicts. By 2008, that number fell to 28%. And from 2001 to 2008, the number of people being treated for their addiction went up by 20%. Now, I'm going to break character for a minute. I'm going to ask if we could open one or two doors. It's kind of hot. Thank you. I don't want anyone to be uncomfortable, though.
No, it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Just because of the noise.
Oh, all right, yeah.
Well, they're going to be quiet. Don't worry about it. You're the main squeeze right now. It's all on you.
Without even factoring in the savings from health benefits, Portugal estimates there was no increase in spending because funds for treatment by the public health services were diverted from the justice system. They're happy with the results. And Switzerland gives us another example. In the late 80s and early 90s, Switzerland had an intense problem of drug abuse. I remember seeing documentaries on television about it, particularly heroin abuse, along with increasing numbers of HIV/AIDS cases as a result of illicit drug use. Based on careful study, they developed a new drug policy that changed from a solely policing one to one based on 4 pillars: prevention of drug use, treatment for drug dependence, harm reduction, and policing. Switzerland began to look at drug addiction as a disorder or illness. And as part of this change, in 1994, they developed an experiment to treat heroin addicts with, are you ready, government-manufactured heroin. In addition, the Swiss authorized methadone programs, safe injection rooms, needle exchange programs across the country, including prisons. And let me point out that American prisons are arguably the most secure in the world. Each one has a drug problem. Taking the drug trade out of the illegal realm gave Switzerland the ability to be able to control the use of drugs. The patients can obtain heroin only at the clinic, and it must be consumed on site. And they must surrender their driver's license to participate in the program. I think that's a pretty good idea, too. Incredibly, not one person has died of a heroin overdose. The program resulted in an average drop of 80% in felony crimes committed by patients who'd been in the program for at least a year. Rates of HIV and hepatitis among drug users have also plummeted. They significantly reduced consumption of illicit heroin and illicit cocaine, which put a huge dent in the business of illegal dealers. When drug use becomes legal, drug cartels will cease to exist. And again, despite catastrophic warnings that helping drug addicts instead of prosecuting them sends the wrong message, the Swiss program has led to fewer new heroin users. Keep that in mind. Fewer heroin users. The reasons for this are unclear. Many experts feel that it's because the program makes heroin seem unattractive to young people. Well, it's not hard to understand. There's also less of a social opportunity to be introduced to heroin. They're not hanging around with criminals. The use is done in more of a medical environment. Switzerland's comprehensive public health approach also saves money. Because of the reduced rates of crime, court and police costs have also been reduced. The Swiss are happy. Furthermore, elements of the program have been emulated by other countries: Germany, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, England, Spain, Canada, the U.S. No, not the U.S. In the Netherlands, where cannabis is de facto legalized, the marijuana usage rates are half the rates of the U.S., where it's illegal. Where cannabis is de facto legalized, the marijuana usage rates are half the rates of the U.S. This was explained by the health minister when he said, "We have succeeded in making marijuana boring." It isn't sexy anymore. The mystique is gone. According to a commission that includes former heads of state, a former UN Secretary General, a business mogul, the global war on drugs has failed, and governments should explore legalizing marijuana and other controlled substances. The Global Commission on Drug Policy argues that the decades-old worldwide war on drugs has failed with devastating consequences for individuals and societies around the world. They went on to say political leaders and public figures should have the courage to articulate publicly what many of them acknowledge privately: that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that repressive strategies will not solve the drug problem, and that the war on drugs has not and cannot be won. This 19-member commission includes former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, George Shultz, who was a cabinet member under both Presidents Reagan and Nixon. They discussed the enormous toll the war on drugs is having around the world. A British member of a think tank that seeks to reform drug policies said the United States should look at the huge cost of incarcerating large numbers of people, the damage it's done, and the extraordinary situation with armed conflicts and militant groups financed by consumption in the US and the UK. The Commission called for drug policies based on methods proven to reduce crime, lead to better health, and promote economic and social development. They pointed out that arresting and incarcerating tens of millions of these people in recent decades has filled prisons and destroyed lives and families without reducing the availability of illicit drugs or the power of criminal organizations. And the Commission was especially critical of the US, saying it must change its anti-drug policies from being guided by anti-crime approaches to ones rooted in healthcare and human rights. Not surprising, the Office of the White House Drug Czar said the report was misguided. The Office of National Drug Control Policy said that making drugs more available will make it harder to keep our communities healthy and safe, without any evidence to support this cliche. What makes our communities dangerous is the fact that illicit drugs are unregulated and sold on the streets of many of our neighborhoods. We have to face the fact that some people will always be addicted to something. We have to try to minimize that number of people and help people who truly need help. Some people are more vulnerable than others when it comes to addictions. Some people become addicted to certain activities, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, gambling, that many of us, most of us, can take or leave alone. Keep in mind that when drugs were made illegal in 1914, the government justified it by stating that 1.3% of the population was addicted to drugs. And remember, in 1970, the war on drugs was begun because at that time it was estimated that 1.3% of the population was addicted. Well, in 2010, how many people do you think were estimated to be addicted? After about 90 years of illegality, including over 40 years of a war on drugs. Did I hear it? 1.3%. Now, let me be clear. We don't advocate or promote any type of drug use. But we also don't advocate wasteful, harmful, misguided policies that don't work. It's time for a new approach. We want to see drugs legalized, regulated, and taxed. By no means are we advocating a free-for-all, anything-goes approach. We want them legalized, regulated, and taxed. I want to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about the problem. I hope that you will agree with me that drug addiction is a public health matter, not a matter for criminal justice. We at L.E.A.P need all the support we can get, not for ourselves, we're okay. We need support in order to be able to help those people who will have their lives severely damaged, some destroyed, by getting arrested for violating our drug laws. We cannot afford to continue destroying the futures of so many young Americans. It hurts all of us to lose the potential they represent. If you would like to support the work we do, the best way to do it is to join L.E.A.P, because if we're going to change these drug laws, we have to operate or create a grassroots organization to do that. If we can get 1 million private citizens to join L.E.A.P in order to offer a real solution, we can then go to Washington and force the legislators to change the laws. We've already started those changes in this country. 15 states have already decriminalized some marijuana use by adults. 18 have legalized medical marijuana. Colorado and Washington have legalized, regulated, and taxed marijuana use by all adults. There are similar bills now pending in the legislatures of Massachusetts, Maine, Rhode Island, and Oregon. You can help. Go to L.E.A.P, leap.cc, and you'll see it in the brochure. Sign up. Join us in this struggle. It's free, and we can save lots of lives. I've got more brochures if everyone didn't get one. We've got to try a better, smarter approach to this problem.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. Audrey, just speak loudly.
I'm impressed with L.E.A.P. I've joined L.E.A.P. I've heard
Oh, good.
speakers, Peter Chris, I've heard
Oh,
speakers
good.
in Florida, mainly at Libertarian venues. I'm wondering if, and that's like preaching to the choir. I'm wondering if you have an attempt to influence PBA unions or things like that, for example.
They're working on it, and that's a very good suggestion. They're working on it. We're trying to speak to as many organizations as possible, and we're working on it. Thank you.
I wanted to say for Michael Levine and others, how are you going to get the CIA and Mossad out? That's how they finance a lot of the wars and all that.
You get people out of the illicit drug business, whoever they are, government, non-government, whoever, by legalizing drugs. Once you legalize drugs, you've regulated how they're created, how they're manufactured. You can't do it underground.
Of course, they still have influence, like CIA has a lot of influence.
Whoever. As long as it's illegal, there is, it's a free-for-all.
Right.
So guns have been in the news a lot lately.
I've
I guess
heard.
There's about 9,000 or 10,000 homicides a year. How many are drug-related? Do you have any idea?
I don't have the numbers now, but I'm come from Westchester, and just recently in the news was a story of two brothers. One of them died at home from an overdose. His brother was taken to the hospital in time. I don't know the numbers, but there are too many. There are many, way too many.
What other groups have you spoken to besides Libertarian?
Well, I speak to schools. Others of us have been in at the UN meeting in someplace in Europe, I forget. We're all over the country. I spoke to a Brazilian delegation the other day, and we have a large presence in Brazil. So lots of different groups. I speak to college students, Rotary clubs, all kinds of groups.
When you were working narcotics, did you imagine to yourself that you were solving a problem, or when
Sure.
When did you realize? When did you come to believe that this was a pointless endeavor?
Yeah, it took me a long time. It took me a long time to realize it, and long after I was done in narcotics. And when I worked in narcotics, I knew I was doing the right thing. It was the right thing. We would get rid of the drug dealers, and the problem would be solved. The problem just went on and on and on. I just got tired of hearing one more story on television about largest drug haul ever. You know, and it's not that I didn't believe it, I did believe it, but when do these drug hauls stop? When does the stuff stop? And that's when it came to me that what we're doing is nuts.
In order to bolster the argument for decriminalization, in your experience, has the medical profession ever come into focus in the judiciary or the legislation in order to promote its medicinal purposes? I've heard some physicians promote that for all medicinal purposes to some of these
Well,
illicit drugs like heroin as painkillers in hospitals.
I can't hear everything, but if you're talking about the legislature or the judiciary, we need the legislature.
Joanne,
The
it's asking
judiciary.
about the medical establishment. It's
So-
asking about doctors.
Where are you?
Asking about the medical establishment.
Oh,
Do they come into focus as consultants with the judiciary and the legislation to promote the medicinal purposes of the drugs themselves?
oh yeah, that's an interesting thought. No, we have not gotten involved in that. That certainly would be justification for legalizing them, and a good justification. We don't rely on that justification. You know what we say? People, this is going to be amazing, but you know, some people like to get high, some people like to get a buzz on, some people like to feel good, some people like to have a drink. That's what human beings are like. Human beings like to kick back and feel good once in a while, using substances. I know it's amazing.
That, but also the theory is if Johnson & Johnson were making heroin, it would be a heck of a lot safer, and we wouldn't have to worry about it being
Absolutely.
with rat poison.
I don't want to buy aspirin from somebody on the street because I can't buy it at QVC. I don't want to buy my drugs on the street. So of course, if a reputable company is producing this stuff, you can feel that it's safe.
Let's take a few more, maybe David over there, because he hasn't spoken yet. Open spoken. David.
I don't care.
Yeah, you know, as libertarians, you know, a lot of times we have a problem in initiation of force, and taxation requires initiation of force. And one thing, I think, talking to a libertarian crowd, one thing I think about with legalizing drugs, I mean, the amount of money that we would save on enforcement, on incarceration, on prosecution, all of these things, and plus, I mean, even on welfare expenses, because you wouldn't be separating poor families, people would be able to stay home, work,
Yep.
and take care of their children. All of those things, I mean,
And
so
paying
much,
taxes.
trillions of dollars that we would save
Yep.
just in that. We don't need to tax if we legalize. We just need to legalize. You just get over it.
Yeah. I can't add to that.
Yes, Alan, you mentioned that federal government spending $20 billion on this war drugs, states $40 billion, okay, $60 billion. What is money's unaudited, what the hell? But my point is, this money is spent on the illicit drug industrial complex. This people include NARCs, judges, DAs, prison operators, the whole usual suspect who benefit from this. Including Hollywood and TV, who have all these plots that have drug dealers.
You have a question off that she can't hear.
Yeah.
Okay, I said that you mentioned that the federal government's paying $20 billion on war drugs, and the states $40 billion and $60 billion. All this money is unaudited. So whatever they spend, it's money that's spent on the illicit drug industrial complex, which consists of the usual suspects, the NARCs, DAs, judges, and prison operators. Now, and also Hollywood and TV, whose many crime shows has drug angle on it. All beneficiaries. Now, this group is also a huge lobby. How are you going to get over them with your schools to decriminalize?
If we can convince legislatures to legalize drugs, everything else will fall out of the way. The other obstacles will disappear. Drugs, heroin, you mentioned heroin, cocaine, people say, ooh. We have demonized all these substances. Once they're legalized, the aura will be gone. The mystique about them will be gone. Kids won't be hanging out with other bad guys and criminals being cool. It will be so different once drugs are legalized. The money will come from a reduction in criminal justice costs. We won't need to pay police to spend their time chasing after low-level, nonviolent drug law violators. And we might get better results with robberies and assaults and rapes and homicides.
Real crimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question. Scott.
Does LEAP have a legislative working group holding that we could go online and look and see which bills you guys are proposing?
What we are doing is looking at bills that are being proposed in other states, and we're commenting on them. And we are giving the people in those states our comments, our thoughts about them, and yeah, we are helping to promote. In fact, we're helping to promote the laws pending in Massachusetts, Maine, Rhode Island, and Oregon as well.
So are your efforts based more on the states than the federal
Both.
government?
We're trying both. We have an office near Washington, and we're going to try that way also, because federal law overrides state law, and federal law is supreme. So any of these states that enact laws that are contrary to the federal laws in place are in violation.
That's what I was getting at, because you see
Yeah.
all these kids in California that are growing.
Right.
They're thinking that it's legal.
But what can the feds do if the states keep insisting and insisting and insisting? Eventually, they're going to have to give way.
They have to fold.
Yeah.
Okay, Bill, last question.
Yeah, under nullification, which after the Civil War, this was considered a compromise. Nullification is a compromise where you don't have to secede from the Union. The states could say we're nullifying this as a post-Civil War compromise of not having to secede from the Union for federal violation of state sovereignty. And by nullifying, that means that we could say we find nothing in the Constitution that empowers the federal government to have jurisdiction over your body.
And
Eric
the,
Holder will send in the troops.
and the Supreme Court says, when did you get to be a Supreme Court justice? The Supreme Court makes that decision, and the Supreme Court hasn't said to us that it's okay to nullify laws that we don't like.
All right, the last question, Mr. Treason.
Well, it would seem to me if a state wanted to, they could make a state law that directs any jury within that state that if they think that state law, which would be whatever state law would happen to be, is against federal law, then the jury would be obligated to find in favor of state law.
Okay.
That's where you got your
Only in drug cases? Or how about in assault cases? How about some rape cases?
just drug law.
Well, it's not good policy. It's not good public policy.
Drug law?
No, telling jurors that they can violate the law, that they can nullify.
If you make that change for drug law alone, then they could get that without having to secede.
Yes, yes, right. We don't want secession. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The states are working on it, and the states are putting pressure on the federal government, and the feds are going to have to change.
Okay.
That's Congress.
Joanne, thank you so much. Joanne
Thank
Naughton.
you.
And there's literature about L.E.A.P that I distributed.